The decree did not come as a whisper, but as a thunderous, collective roar that shook the very foundations of the great citadel. The Galactic Council, an ancient and ponderous body of 1,000 civilizations, had finally reached a consensus born of fear and steeped in envy. The humans were declared dangerous. They were a contagion of ambition, a species that moved too fast, thought too broadly, and dreamed too loudly for the comfort of the older, slower races. With the cold, clinical finality of a death sentence, the Council issued its ultimatum. Humanity was to be excised like a malignant tumor from the body politic of the stars. They demanded a total withdrawal. Every ship, every station, every soul carrying the genetic imprint of Earth was ordered to retreat across the void and return to the ancestral isolation of the Sol system. To the gathered throngs of delegates, who braced themselves for a bloody defiance, the response was a shock that rippled through the chambers like a physical blow. There was no defiance. There were no desperate pleas for mercy, no rattling of sabers, and no diplomatic stalling. To the absolute astonishment of the galaxy, the humans simply bowed. With an eerie, coordinated grace, they agreed to comply immediately. They began the monumental task of scrubbing their presence from the stars, systematically dismantling every outpost and withdrawing every human influence from Galactic Council space with a speed that defied logic. In the wake of the exodus, a wave of jubilant celebration swept across the Council worlds, a cacophony of relief that the human problem had been solved without a single shot fired. They drank to the restoration of the old order, to a galaxy finally quieted of Terran noise. But amidst the popping of corks and the singing of anthems, a senior diplomat named Crixcar sat in the shadows of his private balcony, untouched by the surrounding mirth. Crixcar, a creature of long memories and keen instincts, felt the cold prickle of suspicion crawling along his spine. He looked upon the empty berths where human freighters once sat and saw not a retreat, but a riddle. He felt in his gut that there was something profound and terrible that the Council was missing, a hidden layer to this sudden surrender. Yet, his suspicion was heavily laced with a more personal, agonizing sorrow. Crixcar had fallen victim to a most peculiar and potent Terran vice. He had become hopelessly, shamelessly addicted to the digital archives of funny cat videos. The thought that his supply of clumsy felines and surprised kittens would now vanish behind an impenetrable border was a tragedy he felt more keenly than any territorial shift. He was a statesman of high standing, yet he found himself grieving for the lost joy of a tabby falling off a sofa. As the days turned into weeks, Crixcar watched the final stages of the evacuation through high-powered sensors, his brow furrowed in deep thought. The process was unfolding with a mechanical, terrifying perfection. It proceeded peacefully, yes, and with a staggering efficiency, but it was the velocity of the withdrawal that kept Crixcar awake during the celestial cycles. It moved rather too quickly, far too quickly for a species allegedly caught off guard by a sudden expulsion. There was none of the chaos one would expect from a trillion people uprooting their lives. There were no frantic distress calls, no logistical bottlenecks, and no panicked abandonment of assets. To Crixcar's trained eye, it looked less like a hastily thrown-together flight and more like a drill that had been rehearsed 1,000 times. It was as if the humans had not only expected this day but had actively planned and even prepared for the exact moment the Council would turn on them. The evacuation felt like the closing of a trap that had been set decades ago, and the Council was walking into the center of it with cheers on its lips. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of triumph when Crixcar was invited to a small, informal gathering of delegates, intended to celebrate the departure of the very last human ship from Council space. The host, a pompous official who had been among the loudest voices calling for the banishment, stood at the center of the room, cradling a crystalline decanter. With a flourish of self-importance, he began pouring a rich, amber liquid for his guests, identifying it with a smug grin as Terran wine. He loudly proclaimed the vintage to be rare and expensive, a relic of a vanished civilization that would never again grace their tables. Yet, even as he spoke of its scarcity, he was pouring it with a reckless, heavy hand, offering massive, overflowing measures to every guest in the room. Crixcar watched the wine splash into the glasses and felt his suspicion crystallize. He stepped forward, his voice a low, measured rasp as he questioned his host. Now that there is a total embargo on all Terran goods, and such a wine as this is legally impossible to replenish, Is it truly a wise course to consume it with such abandon? Should you not be rationing such a treasure, if it is indeed as rare and expensive as you claim? The host did not falter. Instead, he leaned in and gave Crixcar a slow, knowing wink, a gesture that spoke of secrets kept in the dark. Of course. Absolutely. You are quite right, Crixcar, he said with a jovial laugh. Another glass, honored guest? Drink deep. In the hours that followed, the scales began to fall from Crixcar's eyes, and he saw the gala not as a celebration of victory, but as a showcase of a hidden truth. He saw this baffling behavior replicated in every corner of the room, and soon, in every district of the capital. Terran goods that should have been non-existent, luxuries that required complex supply chains now supposedly severed, were appearing in staggering abundance. The irony was a bitter pill. Those very delegates who had stood at the podium and spat the most venomous rhetoric against the human presence were the ones who now possessed the greatest hoards of forbidden human treasures. From silk analog textiles to high-end Terran electronics, the banished goods were everywhere. The climax of his realization came in a quiet hallway, where he was approached by a Corvellian trader, a species known for their ability to find a profit in a vacuum. The trader leaned in close, his voice a conspiratorial hiss. He whispered that he could still secure the latest Terran cat videos for Crixcar, though the logistics of such a feat meant the price would be significantly higher than before. Crixcar looked at the trader's greedy eyes and finally understood the shape of the ghost he had been chasing. The revelation struck Crixcar with the force of a cosmic collision. He understood at last exactly what the humans had done. They had not retreated in shame. They had pivoted in strategy. When the Council had slammed the gates on official trade routes, choking the flow of Terran produce with bureaucratic red tape and ideological bans, the humans had simply descended into the shadows. They had found the unofficial capillaries of the galaxy, moving their goods through the vast, pulsating veins of the black economy. They were no longer shackled by the Council's endless regulations. They were no longer stifled by its heavy-handed quotas. They were no longer hindered by the jealous oversight of inferior rivals. By accepting their expulsion, they had achieved a paradox. They were free to sell their wares without the interference of the very Council that had sought to exile them. The Council had not delivered a punishment. It had granted a liberation. Crixcar recalled with a shiver how many times the Council had restricted humanity from developing certain revolutionary technologies or entering nascent markets simply because the Terrans evolved too quickly for the Council's comfort. Now, the tethers were cut. The humans could innovate at the speed of thought, and the Council, instead of possessing the power to halt them, was now their most voracious and desperate customer, covertly buying every new service the humans dared to dream into existence. The celebration in the Great Citadel was short-lived, however, as the cold reality of economics began to bite. The Council soon became deeply concerned, then outright panicked, by the precipitous drop in tax revenues. The ledger books, once overflowing with the tithes and duties collected from the sprawling human trade networks, were now bleeding red. The official trade had vanished, and with it, the Council's ability to skim the cream off the Terrans' labor. Yet, the data showed a strange anomaly. Earth was still a hungry consumer. The humans continued to buy raw materials from the Council worlds, the ores, the gases, the exotic elements they required for their industry, but they did so with a silent, stoic acceptance of a new reality. They no longer benefited from the lower preferential rates reserved for Council members. Instead, they purchased their supplies at the punitive, inflated non-Council rates, paying the premium without a single word of protest or a single diplomatic complaint. In a desperate bid to restore their coffers and assert their dominance once more, the Council delegates convened to claw back the lost wealth. They moved with a predatory glee, voting to place astronomical extra sales taxes on every good the humans sought to purchase from Council space. Overnight, the prices for essential commodities and advanced technologies doubled, then tripled, as the Council patted itself on the back for its perceived brilliance. They congratulated themselves in the halls of power, convinced that they had successfully hobbled the Terrans for a second time. First, they had stripped them of their right to sell openly. Now, they would bleed them dry by doubling the price of everything they needed to buy. It was a strategy of total economic strangulation, or so they believed, as they watched the price tickers climb into the stratosphere. But the silence from the Sol system remained unbroken, a void that was more terrifying than any shouting match. The Terrans did not complain. They did not beg for relief. They did not even attempt to negotiate. They simply paid the higher prices, their credits flowing into the Council's treasury with a steady, rhythmic certainty. This unnatural silence was deeply unnerving to a few, like Crixcar, but the vast majority of the Council interpreted it through the lens of their own arrogance. They saw it as the quiet resignation of the defeated, the pathetic weakness of a species that had run out of options. But Crixcar knew better. He saw the movement of wealth and realized the hidden truth. Earth was now flush with Council credits, harvested from the illicit, tax-free sales of their black market luxuries. These credits, however, were only valuable within the borders of the Council. Thus, the humans' continued purchase of raw materials at inflated prices was not a sign of desperation. No, it was a masterful liquidation strategy. They were converting their mounting piles of worthless Council paper into something tangible, something physical, and something worthwhile. The very building blocks of a future the Council could not even imagine. As the cycles passed, the Council's self-congratulation turned to a hollow, gnawing confusion. It became undeniably clear that the higher prices and the restricted trade lanes were not hurting the Terran economy in the slightest. In fact, by every clandestine metric Crixcar could find, the human economy appeared to be expanding at a terrifying rate. They were engaged in a form of economic alchemy. They were using the Council's own currency, extracted from the delegates' own pockets via the black market, to pay the Council's own inflated taxes. The entire exercise had become a circular, self-defeating farce for the Council, a closed loop where the humans grew richer while the Council's tax revenue became a meaningless bookkeeping entry. And because it all happened in the shadows, it was entirely tax-free for the humans, a grand enterprise of prosperity built upon the Council's own greed and vanity. Streamlined logistics. Within the sovereign borders of Sol, a miracle of industrial philosophy was unfolding, born from the very isolation the Council had intended as a prison. Without the exhausting, spirit-draining need to cater to the whims of a vast, diverse, and often contradictory galactic market, human production underwent a transformation into something hyper-efficient and terrifyingly focused. They no longer wasted their genius on universal adapters for 1,000 alien ports or translation layers for 1,000,000 dialects. Instead, they focused with a singular, laser-like intensity on exactly what they required for their own survival and their own ascent. This radical simplification of the human machine effectively reduced waste to a ghost of a memory and optimized their supply chains into a singular, unbreakable thread. It was a triumph of domestic focus, a streamlining of the soul of their industry that made every factory, every shipyard, and every laboratory a temple of pure, unadulterated productivity. Reallocated resources, the great fleets of humanity, which had once been scattered across the stars like seeds in the wind, now returned to the fold with a renewed sense of purpose. Ships that had previously been engaged in the tedious, bureaucratic dance of official galactic trade were now liberated from the Council's chains. These vessels and the seasoned personnel who manned them were not left to rot in dry dock. Instead, they were aggressively retasked, redirected, and reborn for more vital pursuits. They were poured into internal commerce that knit the Sol system together into a single economic heart. They were sent into the dark voids of exploration to find what the Council had missed, and they were funneled into massive military and defense projects that fortified their home with a wall of steel and fire. Every hour previously wasted on Council paperwork was now spent strengthening their internal capabilities, turning the Sol system into an impregnable fortress of innovation and might. Yet, as Crixcar paced the cold marble of his study, he knew that even this industrial renaissance did not tell the whole story. No, that would not be the extent of the human gambit. His intuition, sharpened by centuries of deceit, suggested that the humans were also aggressively increasing their trade with the non-Council members, the outcasts, the rebels, and the forgotten civilizations that drifted on the lawless edges of Council space. While the Council looked inward, obsessed with its own fading glory, the humans were reaching outward, building a new web of alliances that bypassed the Great Citadel entirely. Consequently, even after paying the Council's vindictive extra taxes, Earth found itself possessed of a staggering surplus of alien currencies. To dispose of this mounting pile of credits, they did something truly audacious. They began buying alien businesses within the Council itself, using them as elaborate fronts for their clandestine operations. This allowed them to subtly pass Terran knowledge, revolutionary new processes, and advanced patents developed in the labs of Earth directly into the heart of Council worlds. They were increasing their influence by inches and miles while simultaneously maintaining the clever illusion that the aliens themselves were the ones competing and succeeding against the vanished humans. The genius of the play was revealed in the mundane details of galactic life. When an alien business was awarded a lucrative contract to manage a planetary communication network, it would suddenly and miraculously deploy a human innovation that increased efficiency by 100-fold. The Council delegates could then stand before their peers and proclaim with swelling pride how their own native alien businesses were now performing the work that the Terrans used to do, and doing it better than the humans ever could. They basked in the sunlight of their own propaganda, all while conveniently ignoring the fact that human minds were the architects of their success. They went home to their luxury estates to enjoy their human-made illegal goods, blissfully unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant, that the very infrastructure of their lives was now being held together by the strings of human puppet masters. In this masterful way, the humans had achieved a feat of economic infiltration that was as invisible as it was total. They had secured a firm foot in the door for services they could not easily provide through the raw channels of the black economy, and they had introduced a tide of new goods that the aliens had never even dreamed of, wonders like advanced consumer electronics that became instant necessities. Furthermore, many of these human-controlled entities were now directly involved in the extraction and sale of the very raw materials that Earth continued to buy. Although these alien companies were strictly forbidden by Council law from lowering their prices to the humans, the arrangement allowed the Terrans to ensure that every credit they spent was ultimately recycled back into their own hands on the Council side of the border. It was a perfect, frictionless system of wealth preservation, a game where the humans owned the board, the pieces, and the very rules by which the Council thought it was winning. Slowly but surely, the rot of dependence began to fester beneath the glittering surface of the Council's apparent triumph. Key industries, the very marrow of galactic civilization and vital infrastructure, the nerves of the star-spanning empire, began to fall under the effective, though invisible, control of Terran interests. The Council might still cling to the hollow comfort of the licenses embossed with their ancient seals. They might still claim ownership of the physical assets on their dusty paper ledgers. They might still boast of sovereign control over their planets and moons. But the reality was a mirror image of their delusions. The operational control was human, the patents were human, and the profits were flowing, in an unstoppable torrent, into Terran-managed entities. The Council had arrogantly believed they had achieved independence from human goods and services, but they had merely traded a visible partner for a hidden master. They were becoming more dependent than ever before on human innovation and management, now delivered through the hollowed-out shells of alien proxies. It was a masterpiece of subversion. They were not being conquered, they were being inherited. The realization gnawed at Crixcar with a relentless, cold logic. The humans had never truly left because they were defeated. No, they had left to set a more complex, a more devastating, and a more long-term trap than anyone in the Citadel could have conceived. It was a move of such breathtaking brilliance that it left Crixcar in a state of stunned admiration, even as he felt the foundations of his world crumbling. The humans had leveraged their inherent economic strength, their boundless ingenuity, and, most cruelly of all, the Council's own towering arrogance against them. They had used the Council's fear to provoke an expulsion that served as the ultimate smokescreen for a total takeover. It was not a retreat. It was an investment. It was not a flight. It was a deployment. As Crixcar delved deeper into the encrypted trade manifests, he noticed a chilling pattern of cooperation that defied 1,000 years of history. He saw a massive manufacturing business on one side of the galaxy suddenly and seamlessly coordinating its output with a logistics company owned by a rival species on the other side. Two alien cultures that had harbored a murderous, ancestral hatred for one another since the dawn of their civilizations. Yet, here they were, working in perfect, synchronized harmony. The reason was as simple as it was terrifying. Because both were secretly owned and ruthlessly controlled by human interests, they worked together without friction. The humans were building a massive, interconnected economic infrastructure right under the noses of the Council delegates and the very worlds they claimed to represent. They were forging a new galaxy in their own image, using the Council's own citizens as the labor. The Council's fatal mistake had been to misunderstand the nature of their own weakness. Their strength, or so they thought, lay in the diversity of their members, but in reality, their vulnerability was rooted in the historical animosities and the competitive nature of their species. The humans had recognized this flaw with predatory precision and exploited it by controlling the entities that traditionally wouldn't cooperate, forcing them into a synergistic, Terran-directed whole. They weren't just buying individual businesses. They were building an alternative economic infrastructure right under the Council's nose. This wasn't merely a matter of balance sheets and profit margins. It was about the absolute control of supply chains, the dominance of distribution networks, the mastery of communication lines, and the grip on manufacturing capabilities that crisscross Council space, all of it, every credit, every data packet, every bolt, funneling profit and influence back to the heart of Sol. The final phase of the transformation was already underway, manifesting as a subtle but irresistible shift in the political winds of the Citadel. As these human-owned, or more accurately, human-controlled, alien businesses grew into gargantuan monopolies, they began to wield a significant and undeniable economic clout. This wealth translated directly into a new form of political power, the power of lobbying. Through their alien proxies, the humans could now influence Council policy from the inside, bending trade agreements to their will, shaping regulatory frameworks to their advantage, and even tilting the outcomes of internal elections. They were always pushing, subtly and relentlessly, for outcomes that benefited these alien businesses, knowing full well that every success for their proxies was a victory for their human puppet masters. The Council was being dismantled from within, its laws rewritten by the very hands it had tried to cast out. The twilight of the Council's autonomy did not arrive with the screaming of sirens or the flash of orbital bombardments, but in the quiet, clinking of glass and the soft glow of a digital screen. In the solitude of his private chambers, a room now decorated with the very Terran artifacts the Council had so foolishly forbidden, Crixcar sat as a witness to the end of an era. He swirled a small, crystalline glass of Terran Panod, watching the liquid cloud into a milky opalescent haze, its sharp anise scent filling the air like a fragrant ghost of Earth's culture. Beside him, a terminal flickered with a fresh, illicit batch of cat videos, the playful antics of ancient Terran predators providing a jarring contrast to the gravity of his thoughts. It was in this moment of quiet indulgence that the full, terrifying truth finally settled in his mind like sediment in a glass. He realized, with a clarity that was as sharp as a blade, that the Council had been absolutely right from the very beginning. The humans were dangerous. They were a threat of the highest order, a species of unparalleled lethality. But their danger did not lie in the fire of their guns or the strength of their armor. They were only dangerous when you attempted to cage them, only lethal when you tried to restrict their boundless spirit. By expelling them, the Council had removed the only thing that kept the humans predictable. Now, the Terrans had achieved the impossible. They had effectively taken control of the entire Galactic Council through the invisible machinery of lobby groups, the vast webs of shadow businesses, and the irresistible gravity of their own innovation. They had conquered the stars, they had subverted the Citadel, and they had inherited the galaxy, and not a single shot had ever been fired.